The story of Christianity is not only about faith and salvation. It is also about how our religion built its power by teaching people to mistrust their own bodies. From its earliest days, Christian leaders worked hard to convince people that the body was not a source of wisdom or joy, but a dangerous trap. The body became something to fear, something to punish, something that needed constant control. This way of thinking did not come from nature. It was not an inevitable human belief. It was a constructed idea, designed to keep people obedient to the church's rules and dependent on its authority. Before Christianity rose, many cultures saw the body as a gift. In ancient Greece, athletes were celebrated for their strength and beauty. Their bodies were displayed in sculpture, praised in poetry, honored in the Olympic Games. The body was seen as something divine, a vessel of vitality. In Rome, public baths were centers of social life. Cleanliness, relaxation, and sensual pleasure were part of daily existence. Across many pagan religions, sexuality was not shameful. Fertility rituals and goddesses of love played important roles in cultural traditions. Life was celebrated through the body, not despite it. Christianity flipped this worldview upside down. Early Christian writers like Paul of Tarsus spoke about the flesh as if it were an enemy of the spirit. He wrote that the desires of the body were opposed to God, and that salvation required suppressing them. Pleasure became suspicious. Desire became sinful. The body was turned into a battlefield where holiness could only be won by discipline, denial, and guilt. This perspective spread quickly because it gave church leaders tremendous influence over people's most personal experiences. If the body was dangerous, then guidance from priests was necessary to navigate life safely. Sexuality became the primary target. Christian teaching labeled sexual desire as something dirty, even within marriage. Virginity and celibacy were elevated as the highest forms of holiness. Entire communities of monks and nuns were built on the belief that denying the body was the ultimate path to God. By contrast, people who embraced their sexuality were marked as weak, sinful, or corrupted. Women, especially, were blamed for tempting men. The story of Eve eating the forbidden fruit was used endlessly to present women's bodies as the source of sin. From that myth grew centuries of shame, fear, and control over female sexuality. This demonization of the body was not just about morality. It had political value. When the church told people that their bodies were evil, it also told them that they could not trust themselves. Pleasure, desire, instinct, these became suspect. Only the church could offer the proper rules to manage them. By weakening people's confidence in their own bodies, the church made itself the gatekeeper of what was pure and acceptable. The body was turned into a source of suspicion, and the church was positioned as the only source of redemption. The consequences of this thinking reached deep into everyday life. Nakedness, which once symbolized natural innocence, was turned into a cause for shame. Art that once celebrated the human form was censored, covered, or destroyed. Practices of medicine and healing that involved the body often came under suspicion. Women who understood midwifery or herbal medicine were labeled as witches because they dared to use bodily knowledge outside the church's control. By attacking the body, the church was also attacking alternative sources of wisdom and power. Even food became moralized. Fasting, self-denial, and bodily punishment were praised as signs of devotion. Many saints were celebrated for starving themselves, whipping their flesh, or sleeping on cold stone floors. This was held up as proof that holiness required the rejection of bodily comfort. Everyday people were taught that enjoying food, sex, or rest too much meant losing sight of God. Pleasure was turned into guilt, and guilt kept people tied to confession, repentance, and obedience. One of the most destructive consequences was how people were taught to hate their own physicality. Instead of feeling at home in their skin, many grew up feeling ashamed of their most natural urges. Children were raised with fear of their developing bodies. Masturbation, menstruation, and desire were treated as dirty secrets. This fear carried into adulthood, making it difficult for people to form healthy relationships, to accept their own desires, or to live without constant anxiety about sin. Generations grew up believing that their bodies were enemies they had to battle daily. The control extended even to illness. When people became sick, instead of understanding disease through natural causes, they often saw it as punishment for bodily sin. Epidemics were explained as God's wrath. Suffering was framed as purification. This way of thinking discouraged medical progress because disease was not just a physical problem, it was a moral one. Healing the body without the blessing of the church could even be seen as interfering with divine will. This kept medical knowledge stunted for centuries, while countless people suffered unnecessarily. By making the body into something shameful, Christianity also fractured the human experience. Mind and body were split apart. The mind, or spirit, was seen as pure and elevated, while the body was seen as corrupt and low. This dualism created a hierarchy within a single person, making people feel torn between who they were physically and who they were told to be spiritually. Instead of harmony, people were taught to live in conflict with themselves. This inner war benefited the church, because those who constantly felt guilty and conflicted were more dependent on religious authority for guidance and forgiveness. But this framework was not inevitable. It was a choice made by religious leaders who saw the strategic value of demonizing the body. By setting up the flesh as the enemy, they created a problem only they could solve. Without the church, people were supposedly lost to sin. With the church, they could hope for forgiveness. This system trapped people in cycles of guilt and redemption that ensured loyalty and control. The irony is that the same religion that preached about the body's corruption also relied on controlling it for its survival. The church insisted on rules about marriage, reproduction, and sexuality, because these were the most intimate parts of life. By inserting itself into the bedroom, the kitchen, and even the bathhouse, Christianity expanded its reach into every corner of existence. No part of human life was free from scrutiny. This was not only about belief, it was about surveillance and regulation. Even clothing became a tool of control. Modesty codes demanded that bodies be hidden. Women in particular were pressured to cover themselves to prevent men from falling into sin. This shifted the burden of male desire onto female responsibility, turning women's bodies into both the source of temptation and the target of regulation. The female body became a battleground where men's spiritual struggles were projected. The result was centuries of oppression that disguised itself as virtue. This worldview shaped entire societies. Laws around sexuality, marriage, and morality often mirrored church teachings. The state adopted the church's suspicion of the body, criminalizing behaviors that did not align with religious rules. Homosexuality was persecuted, adultery punished, and non-traditional sexual expressions condemned. By legislating the church's distrust of the body, governments extended religious control into the realm of power and punishment. At the same time, ordinary people often internalized this suspicion so deeply that they policed themselves. Shame became self-enforced. People confessed sins before priests, not only out of fear of hell, but also out of disgust with themselves. The church did not always need to punish from the outside, because people carried the punishment within their own thoughts. This was perhaps the most successful strategy of all, turning people against their own flesh so thoroughly that control no longer required constant external force. And yet, despite this overwhelming system of guilt and regulation, the body never disappeared. Desire never vanished. Pleasure continued to surface. no matter how hard the church tried to suppress it. This constant tension between natural human experience and religious condemnation created endless cycles of conflict. People sinned, felt guilty, confessed, and returned again to the same patterns. The body became a permanent site of failure, and the church thrived on that failure. This cycle of failure and forgiveness was not accidental. It was the foundation of a religious system that depended on repeating guilt. The body was never meant to be conquered, because if people could actually master their natural urges without the church, they would no longer need priests. The strategy worked best when people felt that their desires were endless traps from which they could never fully escape. In this way, the church created a problem it could never solve, but one it could profit from indefinitely. Monastic traditions show how extreme this worldview became. Monks and nuns often practiced self-flagellation, fasting, and deprivation to the point of injury. Some believed that starving their bodies or beating their flesh brought them closer to God. Hagiographies, or the stories of saints, celebrated these acts as proof of holiness. One saint was praised for never bathing, another for living on nothing but herbs and water, another for sleeping upright to avoid the comfort of a bed. These were not seen as acts of madness, but as the highest examples of devotion. Ordinary believers, even if they did not go to such extremes, were told to admire and imitate these practices as best they could. This mindset also influenced how sexuality was discussed in marriage. The church allowed sex within marriage, but only reluctantly, and only for reproduction. Pleasure itself was still seen as dangerous, even within the marital bed. Theologians like Augustine wrote that sexual desire was evidence of humanity's fallen state, a sign of the corruption inherited from Adam and Eve. For Augustine, even a husband and wife who felt desire for each other were giving in to sin, unless their act was purely for having children. This view stripped intimacy of joy and reduced it to a mechanical duty. For countless couples, this created marriages filled with suspicion of desire, where love and sexuality could never fully merge without guilt. The obsession with controlling the body also shaped attitudes toward women's reproductive functions. Menstruation was treated as unclean. Pregnancy was often seen not as a natural event, but as a reminder of Eve's punishment. Childbirth was associated with suffering as divine justice. Women's bodies were presented as symbols of weakness, temptation, and impurity. This not only justified controlling women, but also reinforced the idea that the female body was inherently closer to sin. It created a culture where women were blamed for men's desires and punished for their fertility, while being denied control over their own lives. Another key point is how Christianity treated nudity. In the ancient world, public nudity was often linked to strength, freedom, or ritual. But Christian leaders equated it with shame. The naked body was no longer a natural state. It was a symbol of sin. Over time, this perspective influenced Western art and culture deeply. While the Renaissance later reintroduced the human form into art, it did so under the shadow of Christian guilt. Paintings and sculptures of naked bodies were often accompanied by religious themes, as if the only way to justify showing the body was by connecting it to biblical stories. Even then, nudity was carefully controlled, with censors covering genitals or altering works that were deemed too tempting. One might argue that demonizing the body helped the church maintain power during times of crisis. In the Middle Ages, when plagues swept through Europe, people were told that their suffering was punishment for bodily sins. Instead of looking for natural explanations, many whipped themselves in public, believing that pain would bring God's mercy. Flagellant movements spread across Europe, where thousands of people beat their flesh in unison as a desperate prayer. This shows how the church's teaching on the body was not just abstract theology, but a force that shaped collective behavior, especially during fear and uncertainty. The fear of the body also fueled suspicion of other cultures. Non-Christian peoples were often described as sexually immoral or overly indulgent in bodily pleasures. This justified conquest and conversion because missionaries claimed they were saving people from the corruption of their flesh. By labeling others as bodily sinners, Christianity reinforced its own superiority while justifying violence and colonization. The same logic that demonized the individual body also demonized entire societies. Even philosophy was reshaped by this suspicion of the body. Thinkers influenced by Christianity reinforced a split between mind and matter. The body was seen as the prison of the soul, something to rise above. This outlook shaped Western thought for centuries, influencing not only religion, but also how science, medicine, and ethics developed. The body was downgraded in value, and with it came the neglect of physical well-being in favor of abstract spiritual ideals. It is no surprise that for long stretches of history, medical progress was slowed by religious suspicion of bodily study, including the banning of dissections in certain eras. The hostility toward the body also extended to pleasure outside of sexuality. Dancing, music, and theater were often condemned because they stirred the senses. Festivals that once celebrated the cycles of nature were suppressed or rebranded as Christian holy days. The church sought to control how people used their time, their energy, and their senses. Joy had to be reframed as dangerous, unless it was expressed through worship. By narrowing the ways in which the body could be celebrated, the church reduced human experience to rigid boundaries it could monitor. This constant suspicion of pleasure created a paradox. While ordinary people were taught to feel guilty for their desires, many church leaders secretly indulged in them. History is full of records of priests, bishops, and even popes who lived in luxury, fathered children, or kept mistresses. Yet the system still worked, because the very act of condemning the body was what allowed them to hold power. The hypocrisy was not a flaw. It was built into the system. Leaders could sin and then repent, while ordinary believers had no choice but to remain trapped in guilt. The demonization of the body did not only affect sexuality and pleasure. It also changed how people related to death. The body, already treated as corrupt in life, was seen as something to discard at death. Burial practices often reflected fear of decomposition, with more emphasis placed on the soul's afterlife than on honoring the body itself. Mourning rituals encouraged people to detach from physical loss and focus instead on salvation. In this way, Christianity's suspicion of the body shaped not only how people lived, but also how they died and grieved. At its core, this worldview created an enduring conflict within human beings. The body was not trusted, yet it could not be escaped. It became a constant reminder of sin, weakness, and failure. Instead of accepting the body as part of life, people were encouraged to see it as a problem. This did not elevate the spirit. It fractured the human experience. It made people strangers to themselves, cut off from their own physicality, forced to treat their natural instincts as enemies. The long-term damage of this worldview is difficult to measure because it shaped not only religious life, but the entire culture of the West. Generations were raised in an atmosphere where shame was more familiar than self-acceptance. Even as societies became more secular, the residue of this suspicion toward the body lingered. People still wrestled with feelings of guilt about sexuality, with fear of pleasure, and with distrust of their own instincts. Cultural norms about modesty, repression, and purity continued long after belief in the doctrines weakened. This is how an idea becomes embedded so deeply that it outlives the institution that created it. The hostility toward the body also influenced how children were raised. Harsh discipline was often justified as a way of breaking the will of the child, training them to resist bodily impulses. Corporal punishment in homes and schools was not only about teaching obedience to parents or teachers, but about reinforcing the idea that the body needed control. Childhood curiosity about sexuality was met with silence, punishment, or fear. Instead of being guided into healthy understanding, children were left with shame and anxiety. The church's teachings made it nearly impossible for generations to grow up with a positive relationship to their own bodies. This demonization also left its mark on gender relations. Women's bodies were treated as public property to be controlled by fathers, husbands, and priests. Virginity was not just a personal matter, but a family's honor, often tied to religious expectation. Women who stepped outside strict norms were not only socially shamed, but sometimes violently punished. This gave men in the church dual power. Men controlled women directly, and the church legitimized that control by framing it as moral necessity. The female body became a constant symbol of danger, and therefore, of control. The effect on sexuality was profound. Homosexuality, in particular, was treated as the ultimate rebellion of the body against divine order. People who expressed same-sex desire were not only punished socially and legally, but taught to believe that their very existence was a crime against God. This produced centuries of persecution, from executions in the Middle Ages to the forced treatments of the modern era. All of it was rooted in the idea that the body's natural diversity was an offense, rather than a reflection of life's richness. The church's insistence on condemning these desires was less about protecting morality, and more about tightening its grip on how bodies could express love. When Christianity expanded into colonized lands, it carried this suspicion of the body with it. Indigenous cultures often had more fluid and celebratory views of sexuality, gender, and the human form. Missionaries condemned these practices as sinful, replacing them with guilt-based teachings. This created cultural fractures that still exist today, where traditional ways of honoring the body were destroyed and replaced with imported shame. The spread of Christianity was not just the spread of a faith, it was the spread of bodily suspicion on a global scale. One way to see how unusual this outlook was is to compare it to other traditions. In Hinduism, for example, certain practices celebrate the body as a path to the divine. In Taoism, harmony with the body is essential to health and spiritual balance. In many indigenous religions, the body is honored through ritual, dance, and connection to nature. Christianity's harsh dualism stands out as one of the most extreme forms of bodily rejection. This uniqueness is often overlooked because it has been so normalized in Western culture that many forget other ways of thinking wherever possible. The church also reinforced bodily suspicion through language. Words like flesh and lust were used with negative connotations, while words like soul and spirit were elevated. Over time, this shaped not only theology, but everyday speech. People began to casually speak of bodily desires as low or base, while associating denial with purity. This constant framing trained people to think in a hierarchy where their own bodies were always ranked lower than their minds or souls. It was not simply doctrine, but a cultural vocabulary that kept suspicion alive in every conversation. The demonization of the body also tied into economics. By teaching that pleasure and comfort were dangerous, the church encouraged people to donate wealth instead of spending it on themselves. Austerity was praised, while indulgence was condemned. But ironically, the same church that condemned luxury often built cathedrals filled with gold, jewels, and art. The message was clear. Individuals must deny their bodily pleasures, while the institution could accumulate material glory. The attack on the body helped fuel the growth of church wealth by encouraging guilt-driven giving. Over time, resistance to this worldview did emerge. During the Renaissance, thinkers and artists began to reclaim the beauty of the human form. Michelangelo's David, for example, celebrated the naked body not as sinful, but as heroic. Yet even then, the influence of Christianity was never far away. Many Renaissance artists had to frame their works within religious themes to avoid censorship. The very act of celebrating the body had to be justified by connecting it back to biblical narratives. Even when progress was made, it was constrained by centuries of suspicion. The Enlightenment continued this shift by promoting reason, science, and naturalism. Medicine advanced as people were allowed to study the body more freely. Yet even with these changes, the weight of Christian teaching about the body remained. Many Enlightenment thinkers themselves still carried assumptions about the superiority of the mind over the body, an inheritance from Christian dualism. The recovery of the body as something valuable was slow and incomplete, because centuries of condemnation had left deep scars. One of the most revealing signs of Christianity's impact on bodily perception is how even today, in secular societies, discussions of sex and the body are often filled with awkwardness, shame, or moral panic. These cultural reflexes are not natural. They are echoes of a long history of bodily demonization. When people struggle to talk openly about desire, when laws still restrict bodily autonomy, when guilt still shadows pleasure, we are seeing the after effects of a religious system that turned the body into the enemy of the soul. The body was not demonized by accident. It was demonized because controlling it was the most effective way to control people. Hunger, desire, illness, reproduction. These are universal human experiences. By claiming authority over them, the church inserted itself into the core of life. It was not enough to preach about heaven or the soul. To truly dominate, the church had to dictate how people ate, loved, slept, and even thought about their own skin. This was a strategy of total control, and it succeeded for centuries, because it reached deeper than politics or law. It reached into the most personal part of existence. The irony is that the body, far from being the enemy of human flourishing, is the very foundation of it. The senses connect us to the world. Pleasure encourages us to bond, to create, to survive. Pain teaches us caution and care. The body is not opposed to wisdom. It is the source of it. To demonize the body is to cut off the roots of human life itself. And yet, this is exactly what Christianity taught. Not to free people, but to bind them. The depth of this control becomes even clearer when we look at how confession was structured. Confession was not only about admitting sins of thought or action, but also about exposing bodily experiences to priestly authority. Desire, touch, sexual acts, even private fantasies. All of these had to be confessed. The church turned the most intimate parts of life into public property under its jurisdiction. This intrusion was framed as spiritual care, but in reality, it trained people to feel that even their most private bodily experiences were never truly their own. Nothing belonged to them, not even their desires. This system blurred the line between morality and surveillance. People lived under the constant sense that their own bodies could betray them. Even when they were alone, they carried the church's gaze within themselves. This internal policing was more effective than any external punishment could ever be, because it reached into the inner life of every believer. The enemy was not just outside, it was within. And if the enemy was within, the only hope was constant submission to religious authority. The view of the body as sinful also shaped art and literature in subtle ways. Medieval morality plays often portrayed bodily pleasures as traps laid by the devil. Characters who enjoyed food, drink, or sex were depicted as falling into ruin. The stories reinforced the idea that bodily joy inevitably led to destruction. Meanwhile, characters who denied themselves, who rejected the body, were celebrated as virtuous. This was more than entertainment. It was moral conditioning, teaching audiences that their natural instincts could not be trusted. This suspicion also shaped science, especially medicine. Dissection of human bodies was banned or heavily restricted for centuries because it was considered disrespectful or sinful to open the flesh. As a result, medical understanding lagged far behind what it could have been. Diseases that might have been treated earlier went misunderstood because the body was too sacred to be studied, yet too corrupt to be celebrated. This contradiction shows the incoherence of the system. The body was treated as both untouchable and unworthy. Either way, knowledge and health were sacrificed. The mistrust of the body also fueled ideas about disability and difference. People with physical deformities or illnesses were often seen as marked by sin. Their bodies were interpreted as signs of divine punishment. Instead of being cared for, they were stigmatized, feared, or excluded. In this way, Christianity's teachings about the body contributed to centuries of discrimination against those whose physical forms did not fit the ideal of purity. The message was cruelly simple. If the body was a sign of sin, then different bodies were evidence of greater sin. At the same time, the church preached resurrection and eternal life in a perfected form. But the irony was that this glorified future body was possible only by hating the current one. Believers were told to despise their present flesh in order to hope for a future. Perfected flesh in heaven. This created a strange paradox. People were promised that the body mattered, but only after death. Life itself was treated as a test of denying the very thing that gave it meaning. The body was reduced to a temporary prison, something to endure until release. This contempt for the body also shaped attitudes toward nature. If the body was corrupt, then so was the material world. The earth, the animals, the environment. All of these were seen as lower than the spiritual realm. The natural world was stripped of its sacredness and seen instead as something to dominate, exploit, and control. This legacy still echoes in how Western societies treat the environment, as a resource to be used rather than a home to be respected. The suspicion of the body and the suspicion of nature are two sides of the same coin. Christianity's demonization of the body was not only spiritual or cultural. It had material consequences. Women's health suffered because medical study of the female body was suppressed. Reproductive control was denied to women because their sexuality was seen as dangerous. People lived with untreated mental and physical illnesses because these conditions were interpreted as moral failings rather than medical issues. The damage was real and measurable, not just theoretical. Over time, resistance to these ideas has grown. Modern psychology has shown how damaging guilt around the body can be. Studies link sexual repression to higher rates of anxiety, depression, and dysfunction. Societies that embrace bodily acceptance often show healthier relationships, lower rates of violence, and greater well-being. These findings confirm what should have been obvious all along, that the body is not the enemy of human flourishing, but its foundation. The suspicion that Christianity spread was not natural truth, but an artificial cage. Yet the legacy persists. Even in secular societies, people still wrestle with feelings of shame around their bodies. Advertising, for example, often weaponizes insecurity, echoing the old religious tactic of making people feel inadequate in order to control them. Laws around sexuality and reproduction still reflect centuries-old religious morality. Education systems often struggle with teaching sex openly because shame has become so ingrained. The body is still seen as something to manage and mistrust rather than to celebrate. This is perhaps the most enduring victory of Christianity's demonization of the body. Even when faith itself fades, the guilt remains. People who no longer believe in sin still feel haunted by the idea that their desires are dangerous. the institution may weaken, but its influence continues through cultural habits, language, and unexamined assumptions. The suspicion of the body has become so normal that many cannot imagine life without it. The truth, however, is that the body was never the problem. Hunger, desire, pleasure, and pain are not signs of corruption, but of life. They are part of what it means to be human. To treat them as enemies is to turn against ourselves. Christianity's demonization of the body was not an act of wisdom, but an act of control, one that left deep wounds on individuals and societies. And until those wounds are fully recognized, the shadow of that suspicion will continue to shape how people live, love, and understand themselves. The legacy of demonizing the body is especially visible in how sexuality has been regulated by law. Even today, legal systems in many countries still carry the imprint of religious morality. Laws against homosexuality, restrictions on contraception, and the policing of women's reproductive rights all trace their roots back to Christian suspicion of bodily autonomy. When lawmakers argue that the body must be controlled according to moral values, they are echoing arguments that stretch back to church fathers who saw pleasure as sinful. The influence of those ideas shows just how deeply religion has shaped even supposedly secular institutions. One of the most damaging elements of this teaching is how it fractured selfhood. Instead of living as unified beings, people were taught to see themselves as divided, a soul that must be saved, and a body that must be conquered. This inner division created generations of people who could not trust their own instincts, who feared their own desires, who saw themselves as weak and sinful for simply being alive. This was not liberation. It was internalized oppression. And when people are taught to distrust themselves, they become much easier to control. The demonization of the body also fueled violence. During the witch hunts in Europe, women who were accused of sexual freedom, midwifery, or simply nonconformity were tortured and killed. Their bodies were publicly destroyed as warnings to others. The obsession with bodily purity provided justification for horrific acts. What began as theology about the flesh translated into real suffering, especially for women who were already seen as the embodiment of temptation. The body was not only condemned in theory, it was punished in blood. The suspicion of the body even shaped architecture. Medieval churches and cathedrals were built to emphasize the soul's journey upward, with soaring ceilings that drew the eyes to heaven. The body, by contrast, was kept subdued in the dim, heavy spaces of the nave. Worship often required kneeling, fasting, or other acts of discomfort, reinforcing the idea that spiritual devotion required the suppression of physical ease. Even the design of sacred spaces communicated the message: the spirit must rise, the body must bow. This suspicion also left a mark on how emotions were treated. Laughter, joy, and passion were often criticized because they involved physical expression. The safest emotions were solemnity, guilt, and sorrow, which aligned better with religious control. Festivals that celebrated the body's vitality were discouraged or replaced with more somber observances. Over time, people were trained to feel that bodily expressions of happiness were somehow less noble than quiet suffering. This inversion of values placed pain above joy, as though discomfort brought one closer to truth while pleasure led one astray. Another layer of control was economic. By encouraging celibacy among clergy, the church ensured that its wealth and property would not be passed down to families. The demonization of sexuality served an institutional purpose. It prevented the fragmentation of church assets. At the same time, ordinary people were urged to have children within strict rules, ensuring that new generations would be born into a system of control. The church's regulation of the body thus aligned perfectly with its financial and political interests. The suspicion of the body also limited scientific curiosity. For centuries, studying anatomy was viewed with suspicion because the body was associated with decay and sin. Only when the Renaissance revived interest in classical knowledge did anatomy begin to flourish again. Even then, early anatomists had to tread carefully, often couching their discoveries in religious language to avoid charges of sacrilege. This long delay in studying the body slowed progress in medicine, costing countless lives. The fear of flesh kept humanity in ignorance far longer than necessary. The fear extended to sexuality outside of reproduction. Pleasure without procreation was especially condemned, whether it was masturbation, same-sex love, or contraception. These practices were seen as the worst offenses because they revealed the body's independence from religious control. If people could enjoy their bodies without involving the church's rules about family and marriage, they would have no need for its authority. This is why these acts were targeted with such intensity, not because they harmed anyone, but because they undermined control. Over time, cracks in this system began to appear. The Enlightenment encouraged people to trust reason, science, and observation over dogma. Philosophers began to argue that the body was not inherently sinful, but part of natural life. Medical advances demonstrated that many illnesses had physical causes, not moral ones. Slowly, the body began to be reclaimed as something worthy of study and respect. Yet even as progress was made, the shadow of Christian suspicion lingered. The struggle to separate the body from guilt did not end. It continues even now. The Industrial Revolution added another layer of complexity. As societies modernized, the body became a resource for labor. Workers were expected to push their bodies to exhaustion in factories, mines, and fields. The church's old language of discipline and denial blended with economic demands, creating a culture where bodily suffering was normalized as part of duty. The idea that comfort or pleasure was dangerous made it easier for people to accept harsh working conditions. In this way, religious suspicion of the body continued to serve systems of control, even outside the church. Psychology in the modern era revealed just how damaging these teachings were. Thinkers like Freud, despite their flaws, highlighted how repression of sexuality produced neurosis and dysfunction. Later research confirmed that guilt about the body was linked to cycles of shame, secrecy, and abuse. The very problems the church claimed to solve were in many ways caused by its teachings. The demonization of the body did not protect people. It trapped them in cycles of fear and repression that harmed mental health for generations. The irony is that the same church that condemned the body could not escape it. Scandals of sexual abuse within religious institutions show how deeply repression can backfire. Priests sworn to celibacy often broke their vows in harmful ways, demonstrating that desire cannot be erased, only distorted by guilt. The very system that tried to suppress the body ended up creating some of the most damaging abuses of it. These scandals are not accidents, but symptoms of a structure built on denying human nature. Even today, echoes of this worldview appear in how people talk about health and fitness. Diet culture, purity language, and moralized eating often frame the body as something to be disciplined, punished, or perfected. Though the language is more secular now, the underlying suspicion remains the same. The body is not to be trusted, only managed. The church may no longer dictate these rules, but the culture it shaped continues to repeat its logic in new forms. The question is why this suspicion of the body has lasted so long. Part of the answer is that it taps into fear. The body ages, gets sick, and eventually dies. For many, this is terrifying. By framing the body as sinful, Christianity offered an explanation for suffering, even if it was a harmful one. Instead of facing the uncertainty of life, people could interpret their pain as part of a divine plan. This gave them comfort, even while trapping them in guilt. The church exploited a universal vulnerability. the fragility of the human body. The fear of death gave the church immense leverage. If the body was weak, temporary, and sinful, then the soul became the only part of a person worth saving. And who controlled the fate of the soul? The church. By lowering the value of the body, the institution raised the value of its own authority. Death, instead of being a natural part of life, became a tool of manipulation. People were told that their bodies would decay in the ground, but their souls could only escape eternal torment if they obeyed. This framework made physical life seem secondary, while making religious obedience feel urgent and necessary. But this bargain had a cost. By teaching people to despise the body, Christianity stripped life of much of its joy. Eating, loving, resting, creating. All of these bodily acts were infused with guilt. Human beings, who might have lived in harmony with their physical selves, instead carried constant suspicion. The simplest pleasures became moral risks. Even laughter could be suspect, because it belonged to the body rather than the soul. This robbed people of the ability to experience their own humanity without anxiety. This suspicion also shaped medicine's relationship with pain. For centuries, pain relief was viewed with suspicion. If pain was a form of divine punishment or purification, then easing it might interfere with God's plan. As a result, people were denied comfort that could have been available, and suffering was prolonged unnecessarily. Only in more recent centuries did medicine begin to treat pain relief as a human right, rather than a spiritual threat. Again, the church's suspicion of the body delayed progress that could have saved countless lives. The suspicion extended even to movement and play. Dancing, which in many cultures is a joyful celebration of the body, was often condemned as sinful. Sports, unless tied to military training, were discouraged because they celebrated physical strength and pleasure. By narrowing the acceptable uses of the body, the church kept people's physical energy directed away from joy and toward labor, prayer, and penitence. The body was only acceptable when it was serving the institution's agenda, never when it was serving itself. The damage was not only external, but internal. People learned to internalize this suspicion so thoroughly that they punished themselves without being told. Ascetics whipped themselves, starved themselves, and deprived themselves of comfort, believing that holiness demanded pain. Even ordinary believers carried internal shame, confessing sins of the flesh that were nothing more than natural instincts. This self-punishment is perhaps the most insidious legacy of the church's teachings. A society that turns people against their own bodies does not need constant external policing. People carry the prison within. The church also exploited the body's vulnerability to illness and reproduction to strengthen its control. Rules against contraception, abortion, and sexual freedom ensured that life and death remained in the hands of religious authorities. Women, in particular, were trapped by this system. They bore children without choice, often risking their lives in childbirth, while being told that this suffering was part of God's design. By tying reproduction to divine command, the church controlled not only individuals, but entire generations. This hostility toward the body even shaped how people thought about knowledge. Curiosity about the body's functions was seen as dangerous, because it might lead to pride or rebellion against divine authority. This suspicion slowed medical and scientific discovery, but it also discouraged people from trusting their own experiences. Someone who felt desire, pleasure, or even pain could not interpret it freely. They needed the church to tell them what it meant. The body was stripped of its own voice, its signals interpreted only through doctrine. The result was a culture where alienation from the self was the norm. Instead of feeling integrated, mind, body, and experience in harmony, people lived divided lives. They were told that their most basic instincts were not trustworthy, that their senses could mislead them, and that only by ignoring their flesh could they approach truth. This was not just theology. It was psychological conditioning that lasted centuries. It created people who could not be at peace with themselves because they were trained to see their own humanity as an obstacle. Even today, echoes of this conditioning appear in how people treat their bodies. The fitness industry often promotes self-punishment, framing exercise as a way to conquer weakness rather than to enjoy movement. Beauty standards push people to see their bodies as never good enough, echoing the old Christian message that the flesh is flawed and must be corrected. The language has shifted from sin to self-improvement, but the underlying suspicion remains. The body cannot be trusted. It must be fixed. The persistence of this suspicion shows how powerful ideas can be when they are tied to control. Christianity's demonization of the body was not just a religious teaching. It was a system of power that entered every corner of life. By framing the body as sinful, the church guaranteed that people would never escape its influence. Every hunger, every desire, every pain became a reminder of their need for guidance, forgiveness, and submission. The body was turned into an endless reminder of dependence. And yet, the body resists. Despite centuries of condemnation, people continue to seek pleasure, to love, to dance, to eat, to celebrate. The persistence of joy is evidence that the body cannot truly be erased or conquered. The very fact that the church had to work so hard, for so long, to suppress bodily instincts proves that they are not weaknesses, but strengths. They are the natural foundation of human life, too resilient to be destroyed by guilt. The persistence of bodily joy, even under centuries of repression, reveals something essential about human nature. No matter how strongly an institution preached guilt, people still fell in love, still sought intimacy, still found ways to celebrate through music, dance, and festivals. In fact, the church often had to absorb or rebrand these celebrations because it could not fully erase them. Pagan fertility festivals were recast as Christian holy days. Dances and feasts were reinterpreted as part of liturgical calendars. Instead of eliminating the body, the church cloaked its celebration in religious language, controlling it rather than destroying it outright. This shows that the body, far from being a curse, was always too powerful to suppress completely. The church's obsession with the body also reveals its own anxiety. If the body were truly as corrupt and worthless, as doctrine claimed, it would not have required such intense policing. The very fact that endless sermons, laws, and punishments were needed proves that the body's appeal was undeniable. People desired, no matter how much they were told not to. The church's war against the body was less a battle against weakness than a desperate struggle against human vitality itself. It was an admission that life is stronger than dogma. But the cost of this war was immense. Generations of people lived alienated from themselves, unable to embrace their own experiences without guilt. Families were shaped by silence and fear around sexuality. Relationships were strained by suspicion of desire. Women carried the weight of being blamed for temptation. Men were told their natural instincts were signs of weakness. The entire framework created a culture of mistrust, not only of the body, but of each other. Instead of intimacy and acceptance, people were trained to see danger in one another's flesh. This suspicion also narrowed the possibilities of art and knowledge. Imagine how much earlier medicine might have advanced if the body had been seen as a source of wisdom instead of sin. Imagine how many works of art were censored, altered, or destroyed because they celebrated the human form. Imagine how many lives were cut short by preventable suffering, all because pain was treated as a test of faith rather than a problem to solve. The demonization of the body was not just a theological choice. It was a barrier to human progress. The cultural residue of this worldview still lingers in subtle ways. People often speak of their bodies as if they were machines separate from themselves, something to be managed, controlled, or fixed. This echoes the old dualism of body and soul, where the body is seen as something lower, less trustworthy. Advertising constantly reinforces the message that the body is flawed and needs correction, feeding industries worth billions. Though the language has changed, the underlying suspicion is the same. Your body is not good enough, and you must rely on external authority, whether religious, medical, or commercial, to redeem it. Yet the cracks in this system are widening. In recent decades, movements that celebrate body positivity, sexual freedom, and holistic health have gained ground. People are beginning to reclaim what Christianity once demonized. Science has shown that pleasure is not sinful, but part of how the brain motivates bonding, creativity, and resilience. Psychology has shown that guilt about the body harms mental health. Philosophy has begun to revisit ancient traditions that saw the body as a partner in wisdom rather than an obstacle. Slowly, humanity is rediscovering what it once knew before religious control: that the body is not an enemy, but an ally. The challenge is that centuries of conditioning cannot be undone overnight. Even when people reject the doctrines of religion, the emotional patterns remain. A person might no longer believe in sin, yet still feel shame about their body. A society might pass laws for equality, yet still struggle with cultural taboos rooted in old religious fears. The ghost of bodily suspicion continues to haunt modern life, reminding us that ideas, once implanted deeply, can outlast the institutions that spread them. But recognizing the origin of these ideas is the first step to overcoming them. When we see that guilt about the body is not natural, but historical, not universal, but constructed, we begin to question it. We begin to ask why pleasure should be suspect, why desire should be feared, why the flesh should be treated as corrupt. And in asking those questions, we loosen the grip of centuries of control. We begin to rebuild a healthier relationship with our own humanity. The body does not need salvation. It needs recognition. It needs care, acceptance, and celebration. The senses that connect us to the world are not traps, but guides. The desires that pull us toward one another are not sins, but the foundation of community and love. The hunger that drives us to eat, the need for rest, the longing for touch. These are not weaknesses, but reminders of what life requires. Christianity's demonization of the body turned all of this into guilt. But history shows that no amount of guilt can erase what is most human. The story of Christianity's suspicion of the body is, in the end, the story of how power can manipulate fear. By exploiting the vulnerabilities of flesh, by turning natural instincts into sources of shame, the church built an empire of control. But the persistence of joy, of love, of pleasure, proves that human beings cannot be fully conquered. The body remains, as it always has been, the center of life. And to reclaim it is not only to reject religious control, but to embrace what has always been true: that to live is to be embodied, and there is no shame in that. The survival of these teachings shows how powerful control over the body can be. When an institution convinces people to mistrust themselves, it no longer needs chains or prisons to enforce obedience. The suspicion is carried within. Christianity understood this and used it with extraordinary effectiveness. By demonizing the body, it created not only rules, but entire ways of thinking, ways that seeped into language, law, and culture. Even people who rejected the faith were still shaped by its legacy, because the suspicion had become woven into the fabric of society. But history also shows that the human spirit, ironically, the very thing Christianity claimed to protect, thrives most when the body is accepted. Cultures that celebrated the body produced art, music, and knowledge that flourished. Where the body was honored, community thrived. Where the body was shamed, creativity withered. The choice to demonize the body did not elevate humanity. It stunted it. It traded vitality for obedience, joy for guilt, progress for control. We can see the long shadow of this choice even in debates today. Discussions around sexual education, reproductive rights, and bodily autonomy are still haunted by religious morality. The reluctance to provide young people with honest information about their own bodies comes directly from centuries of Christian suspicion. The battles over whether people can control their own reproduction echo the same distrust of bodily freedom. These modern conflicts are not new. They are the continuation of a very old struggle between life as it is and life as the church wanted it to be. Recognizing this history is liberating. When we see how deeply these teachings were designed to control, we can begin to separate natural human experience from imposed guilt. We can start to rebuild a relationship with the body that is based on acceptance rather than fear. We can treat pleasure as part of life rather than as a threat. We can treat illness as a problem to solve rather than a punishment to endure. We can see desire as a source of connection rather than corruption. In doing so, we reclaim what was taken. The task is not only individual, but cultural. Societies shaped by Christianity's suspicion of the body need to consciously create new narratives. Education must include honest discussions of sexuality, health, and bodily acceptance. Art must continue to celebrate the human form without apology. Laws must respect bodily autonomy instead of restricting it according to old dogmas. This cultural work is not easy, but it is necessary if humanity is to undo centuries of damage. It is worth noting that some of the earliest critiques of Christianity came from its treatment of the body. Ancient critics mocked Christians for rejecting pleasure and embracing suffering. They saw clearly that such a worldview was unnatural, a denial of life itself. Those critics were right. History has proven that the suspicion of the body did not bring humanity closer to truth or joy. It created cycles of repression that left scars still visible today. The truth is simple. We are our bodies. There is no human life without flesh, without senses, without the needs and desires that come with them. To deny the body is to deny life. Christianity's demonization of the body was never about protecting people from corruption. It was about controlling them through guilt. The fact that people are still recovering from that legacy shows how effective it was. But it also shows how necessary it is to name it, to understand it, and to move beyond it. The body is not shameful. It is not an enemy. It is the source of love, joy, creativity, and connection. The church taught otherwise because it benefited from fear. But fear is not truth. The truth is that the body is the foundation of human life, and accepting it fully is the only way to live without chains. To celebrate the body is not to fall. It is to rise into the fullness of what it means to be human. And that is where this story ends, with the recognition that the demonization of the body was never a divine truth, but a human invention. It was a strategy of control disguised as morality. Once we see that clearly, the spell is broken. The body no longer needs to be feared, because it never was the enemy. It was always the beginning of everything we are.